In the summer of 1944, along a dusty ridge road near the Tuscan town of Suvarito, Italy, German infantry and armor dug into high ground believed they held an unbreakable position. They were wrong. Within hours, that position collapsed, and the soldiers who broke it were men the German army had almost no frame of reference for. American infantrymen of Japanese ancestry, fighting under the flag of a country that had, at that very moment, confined thousands of their own families behind barbed wire on the other side of the world. The Germans who survived that engagement and the many that followed it began referring to these soldiers by a name that would follow them for the rest of the war and into the historical record: the Little Iron Men. This is the story of the 100th Infantry Battalion, the reputation it earned in combat against the German army and the Waffen-SS, and what that reputation reveals about one of the most improbable fighting forces of the Second World War. The engagement at Belvedere was not an isolated incident, and it did not happen in a vacuum. It was the product of nearly a year of continuous combat that had already worn a reputation into the German units defending central Italy, one battle at a time, long before any single dramatic breakthrough made headlines. To understand why German battlefield reporting began treating this particular American unit differently from the infantry divisions around it, the story has to begin not on that Tuscan ridge, but 18 months earlier and 7,000 miles away, in the immediate aftermath of a surprise attack that reshaped how the United States government viewed an entire population of its own citizens. To understand why German commanders were so unprepared for what they encountered in Italy, it is necessary to go back to December 7, 1941. On that morning, the Japanese Imperial Navy attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In the hours and days that followed, suspicion fell immediately on the roughly 150,000 residents of Japanese ancestry living in the Hawaiian Islands, and on the much smaller but more politically exposed population of Japanese Americans on the U.S. mainland. Many of these residents were Nisei, a Japanese language term meaning second generation, referring to American-born children of Japanese immigrants who held U.S. citizenship by birth. Despite that citizenship, the U.S. government's response was swift and, for many families, devastating. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the forced removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans, primarily from the West Coast, into a network of inland detention camps administered by the War Relocation Authority. More than 110,000 people were eventually incarcerated under this policy, the majority of them American citizens who had committed no crime. In Hawaii, the situation played out differently, in part because Japanese Americans made up more than a third of the territory's population and were essential to its economy and infrastructure. Mass incarceration on the mainland scale was judged impractical. But suspicion toward Nisei servicemen already in uniform was immediate. Hundreds of Nisei soldiers who had been serving in the Hawaii Army National Guard, some of whom had helped clear rubble and tend the wounded in the hours after the Pearl Harbor attack, were abruptly reclassified. Many were disarmed, reassigned to menial labor, or placed under suspicion despite their service records. It was against this backdrop of distrust that a decision was made in June 1942 to organize roughly 1,400 of these Hawaii-based Nisei soldiers into a new unit, initially called the Hawaii Provisional Infantry Battalion. It shipped to the mainland and was redesignated the 100th Infantry Battalion. Its soldiers trained at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, and later at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, adopting the motto, "Remember Pearl Harbor," a deliberate statement of loyalty from men whose loyalty the government itself had questioned. The historical context here matters because it shapes everything that follows. The United States Army in 1942 had no established doctrine for how to use a segregated unit composed of soldiers whose ancestry matched that of the enemy in the Pacific. A formal military board convened that June to study the question of Nisei military service and concluded, in its written report, that Japanese Americans should not be trusted with combat roles, citing what the report called the universal distrust in which they were held. This was not a fringe opinion. It reflected mainstream military and political thinking of the period. The existing solution from the Army's perspective was to sideline these men entirely, restricting them to labor battalions or keeping them out of the war altogether. That approach failed to account for the volume of Nisei volunteers who wanted to serve, and it failed to make use of a manpower pool the Army would eventually need as casualties mounted in Europe. The military and political limitations of the period compounded one another. On the West Coast, the incarceration program administered by the War Relocation Authority, placed families in hastily constructed camps such as Manzanar in California, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, and Topaz in Utah, often after first being processed through temporary assembly centers, including converted horse stalls at facilities like the Tanforan Racetrack in California, where entire families were housed in stalls that still carried the smell of livestock. Young men eligible for military service were, in a substantial number of cases, being asked to volunteer for a country that had simultaneously classified their parents and siblings as security risks. In Hawaii, where no comparable mass incarceration took place, the existing Nisei soldiers of the Hawaii Army National Guard had nonetheless been disarmed and reassigned in the weeks after Pearl Harbor, despite many of them having spent December 7, 1941, helping clear rubble, direct traffic, and assist wounded civilians in the immediate aftermath of the Japanese attack. The existing policy solution, in other words, had already been tried, and it had already failed to resolve the tension between the government's stated need for manpower and its unwillingness to trust the loyalty of an entire ethnic population based on ancestry alone. Key figures pushed against this default policy. Lieutenant General De Los Emmons, commanding the Hawaiian Department, argued that removing loyal Nisei soldiers from all military value was both unjust and strategically wasteful, and he supported channels that allowed young Nisei men in Hawaii, organized initially as the Varsity Victory Volunteers, a labor and construction unit made up largely of University of Hawaii students, to demonstrate their reliability through service. Their record, combined with the emerging combat performance of the 100th Infantry Battalion once it deployed, gave War Department officials evidence to reconsider their assumptions. In January 1943, President Roosevelt authorized the formation of an all-Nisei regimental combat team, the 442nd, declaring in a public statement that Americanism is not, and never was, a matter of race or ancestry. More than 2,600 volunteers came from Hawaii and roughly 1,500 from the mainland, a number of them recruited directly out of the incarceration camps where their families remained confined. They trained at Camp Shelby through early 1944. Command of the 100th Infantry Battalion in its earliest organization fell to Lieutenant Colonel Ferrant Turner, a National Guard officer who had earned the trust of the Hawaii-born soldiers under his command during the difficult transition period when the unit's future in the Army remained uncertain. Once deployed to Italy, the battalion and later the combined 442nd Regimental Combat Team were led through their heaviest fighting by officers including Colonel Charles W. Pence and later in the war, Colonel Virgil R. Miller. Many of the men who filled the ranks would go on to prominent post-war careers that traced directly back to their wartime service records. Daniel Inau, a Nisei volunteer from Honolulu who enlisted despite having been initially barred from service, served with the 442nd, Company E, and later lost his right arm leading an assault on a German machine gun position in the closing weeks of the Italian campaign, an action for which he was awarded the Medal of Honor in the 2000 Review of Wartime Decorations. Inau later served as a United States Senator from Hawaii for nearly 5 decades, becoming one of the most visible public reminders of what the unit had accomplished. These were not exceptional individuals operating apart from their unit's culture. They were representative of a battalion and regiment whose junior leadership consistently produced this kind of individual initiative under fire, which is precisely the quality that repeatedly disrupted German defensive planning in Italy and France. Before the 442nd ever reached the front, the 100th Infantry Battalion was already fighting, and already failing to conform to what German intelligence assumed about American combat capability on this stretch of front. The battalion deployed overseas in August 1943, landed in North Africa at Oran, Algeria, and moved into the Italian campaign that September, coming ashore in the aftermath of the Salerno landings. Assigned to advance guard duty, the battalion advanced 15 miles in 24 hours against determined German resistance over difficult terrain, according to the War Department's own after-action description. Sergeant Shija Joe Takata became the first Nisei soldier of the 100th killed in action, on September 29, 1943, struck by shrapnel after exposing enemy gun positions to his unit. He was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Over the following months, the battalion fought through the Volturno River line and into the brutal, months-long siege of Monte Cassino, one of the most heavily fortified German defensive positions in Italy, anchoring the Gustav Line that blocked the Allied advance toward Rome. It was in this campaign that the battalion earned the nickname that would stay with it for the rest of the war, the Purple Heart Battalion, a grim reference to the volume of Nisei casualties sustained while dislodging German positions that other units had been unable to break. German defensive doctrine along the Gustav and later, the Gothic Line relied on well-prepared positions in mountainous, easily defended terrain, supported by machine gun nests, mortars, and armor held in reserve for counterattack. On paper, these positions should have been able to hold against an understrength, poorly resourced American infantry battalion for extended periods. That assumption failed repeatedly against the 100th. German after-action reporting and captured documents from this period, along with statements later recorded from German prisoners, described repeated instances in which entrenched positions were flanked, infiltrated, or overrun faster than commanders expected. One documented account, recorded from a captured German sergeant named Reinhardt and later relayed through army channels, describes an interrogating German general expressing open surprise that American troops advancing under heavy machine gun fire had taken so few casualties, based on his assumption of how conventional infantry would have behaved under that volume of fire. The German officer had assumed a static, predictable enemy. What he faced instead were soldiers using cover, dispersion, and small unit initiative in ways that consistently outpaced German expectations for the size and equipment of the force in front of them. This pattern reflects a broader failure in how German commanders along the Italian front assessed the units opposite them. Standard German intelligence estimates of the period ranked opposing infantry largely by nationality and equipment scale, with limited allowance for variation in fighting quality within an army's own ranks. Against this framework, a battalion drawn from a racial minority, the Wehrmacht's own propaganda apparatus had spent years describing in dismissive terms, did not fit any expected category, and German units on the receiving end of Nisei attacks were, in a real sense, working from a flawed model of their enemy before the first shot was fired. That model broke down in contact. Positions expected to require days of reduction fell in hours. Flanking routes assumed to be impassable due to terrain were used anyway at cost by soldiers willing to move through terrain German planners had written off as unusable by attacking infantry. The gap between German expectation and German experience, repeated across dozens of engagements from the Volturno River through Cassino and into Tuscany, is what ultimately produced the shift in language used to describe these soldiers, from an anonymous enemy formation to a specifically named, specifically feared adversary. The breakthrough moment that cemented the reputation of the Nisei soldiers as an outsized threat came in June 1944, shortly after the 100th Infantry Battalion was formally attached to the newly arrived 442nd Regimental Combat Team near Civitavecchia, Italy, on June 11, 1944. Because of its combat record, the 100th was permitted to retain its original unit designation rather than being folded anonymously into the regiment's numbering system, an unusual concession that reflected how seriously the army now regarded its reputation. Days later, the combined force engaged German positions at Belvedere, near Suvarito in Tuscany, where German troops held high ground and had positioned tanks and mortar teams to cover the approach. The 442nd, 2nd, and 3rd Battalions engaged the German line directly, while the 100th Infantry Battalion executed a flanking maneuver against the German rear and flank. The result was a sudden, disorienting collapse of the German position. Troops who had expected to hold under direct pressure found themselves attacked from a direction they had not prepared for, and the position broke. Retreating German units were then ambushed by other companies of the 442nd, positioned along their withdrawal route. It was a textbook demonstration of coordinated infantry maneuver executed under fire by troops who, only months earlier, senior army leadership had assumed were unfit for combat responsibility. The mechanics of what made this kind of breakthrough possible are worth explaining in some technical detail, because they were not the product of superior equipment. The 100th and 442nd fought with the same standard-issue American infantry weapons as any other U.S. Army unit of the period, the M1 Garand rifle, the Browning automatic rifle, and standard-issue mortars and machine guns, without any specialized armament advantage over the units around them. What differed was small unit tactical execution. The willingness of individual squads and platoons to press forward under fire rather than pin down and wait for supporting arms, and a demonstrated tolerance for close quarters, high-casualty assaults on fixed positions that more conservative infantry doctrine of the period generally tried to avoid in favor of methodical reduction by artillery and armor. This style of fighting produced faster results against entrenched positions, at the direct cost of higher friendly casualties, a trade-off reflected starkly in the unit's Purple Heart totals. German defensive planning of the period was built around the assumption that attacking infantry would behave conservatively under sustained fire. The 100th and 442nd's pattern of continuing to press an assault after taking losses that would have stalled other units repeatedly broke that assumption at the tactical level, which is precisely the kind of behavior that produces the sort of reputation German field reporting began recording. It was in the weeks following Belvedere, as the regiment continued fighting through central Italy toward Rome and the Arno River, that German battlefield reporting and soldier testimony began consistently referring to the Nisei infantry, using the phrase that would become their most enduring wartime nickname among the enemy they faced: Kleine Eiserne Männer. Little iron men. The phrase reflected two things at once: an observation about the smaller average stature of many Nisei soldiers relative to German expectations of American infantry, and a grudging acknowledgement of a level of aggression, discipline, and battlefield persistence that defied that expectation entirely. A U.S. Army Signal Corps photograph from July 15, 1944, taken in the Orciano area of the 5th Army's front, documents German soldiers surrendering to riflemen of the 100th Infantry Battalion after what the original photo caption describes as a short but rather sharp exchange of fire, a small but concrete piece of documentary evidence for how these engagements were actually unfolding on the ground. Validation of this reputation did not remain confined to isolated field reports. By mid-1944, division and corps-level commanders were requesting the 100th and 442nd by name for difficult assignments, and the units were increasingly used as a spearhead force precisely because of their demonstrated ability to break fortified positions other units had struggled against. This represented a complete reversal from the assumptions in place just 2 years earlier, when the same War Department had judged Nisei manpower too great a security risk to arm at all. The shift was not driven by sentiment. It was driven by results that senior commanders could verify directly through casualty reports, ground gained, and enemy positions taken, the same kind of evidence any army uses to decide which units get the hardest assignments. This pattern repeated itself later that year in the Vosges Mountains of eastern France, during the campaign to liberate towns including Briars and Bifontaine in October 1944. The fighting around Briars was some of the most difficult the regiment encountered, conducted in cold, wet forest terrain that limited visibility and favored the entrenched German defenders, yet the town was taken and held against German counterattacks over several days of fighting. Technical Sergeant Yukio Okutsu of the 100th Infantry Battalion was awarded the Medal of Honor, later upgraded from a lesser decoration in a 2000 review, for single-handedly assaulting German machine gun positions near Briars under fire that October, an action that again illustrated the pattern German forces had already begun to expect and fear from these troops: individual initiative pressed home at close range against fortified positions. The town of Briars itself later became one of the most enduring sites of Franco-Japanese-American memory of the war, with local residents maintaining memorials to the regiment for decades after the liberation, and delegations of veterans and their descendants continuing to return for commemorative ceremonies well into the 21st century. A relationship between a small French town and a Hawaii-based Army Reserve unit that has outlasted nearly every other wartime alliance formed on that stretch of the European front, and one that continues to be documented and renewed by historians and veterans' descendants alike. The most costly and most famous test of this reputation came immediately afterward, in the rescue of the so-called Lost Battalion, a roughly 275-man unit of the 141st Infantry Regiment, 36th Texas Division, that had become surrounded and cut off by German forces deep in the Vosges forest in late October 1944. The terrain favored the defenders absolutely: thick forest, steep uphill approaches, and German positions with interlocking machine gun fields of fire, tanks, and prepared defensive works. The 442nd, with the 100th Infantry Battalion attached, was ordered to fight uphill through this terrain to break the encirclement. Companies K and I of the regiment, which began the operation with roughly 400 combined men, were reduced to fewer than 4 dozen effective soldiers within 3 days of continuous fighting. The regiment nonetheless broke through, reaching and relieving the trapped Texans after several days of close, grinding combat that produced casualties far exceeding the number of men actually rescued, a ratio that became one of the most cited examples in American military history of a unit absorbing catastrophic losses to save another. In 1962, the state of Texas made surviving veterans of the 442nd Honorary Texans in recognition of the rescue. The scale of what the 100th and 442nd accomplished, once the reputation established in Italy carried into France and later into Germany itself, expanded well beyond any single engagement. The combined 100th 442nd Regimental Combat Team fought in 8 major campaigns across Italy, France, and Germany, including the Ro-Marno campaign, the invasion of southern France known as Operation Dragoon, the Rhineland campaign, and the push into the Po Valley in Central Europe in the war's final months. Before reaching the Vosges, the regiment was pulled out of Italy in September 1944 to take part in the exploitation phase following Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France that had begun that August. There, the 442nd fought through the Maritime Alps along the French-Italian border, clearing German positions in mountainous terrain near the towns of L'Esquerne and Cispel, before being redirected north to join the drive into the Vosges. This rapid movement from one active front to another, without extended rest between campaigns, reflected how heavily Allied command had come to rely on the unit's demonstrated reliability under difficult conditions, a reliance built directly on the record established in Italy only months earlier. In the Vosges and Rhineland fighting of late 1944 and early 1945, the regiment increasingly found itself facing not only regular German army infantry, but also better-equipped Waffen-SS formations rotated into the sector as the front stabilized. Units whose own internal reporting culture placed a premium on identifying and flagging unusually effective opposing forces to higher headquarters. It was against this backdrop of elite German formations being fed into the same sector that had already produced the Little Iron Men reputation among regular Wehrmacht troops, that Nisei effectiveness against fortified positions became something German command staff at multiple levels had reason to specifically account for in their planning, rather than a localized anomaly confined to a single stretch of the Italian front. The regiment's 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, operating independently of the rest of the unit during the final weeks of the war, advanced into Bavaria and in late April 1945 encountered and helped liberate prisoners from a subcamp associated with the Dachau concentration camp system. One of the documented instances connecting Nisei soldiers directly to the liberation of victims of the Holocaust, even as their own families remained behind barbed wire fencing in Wyoming, Arkansas, and California. Historians have noted that the precise legal and administrative status of that subcamp, and the sequence of Allied units that reached different parts of the wider Dachau complex that same day, remain subjects of careful historical documentation, but the presence of Nisei artillerymen among the American soldiers who encountered survivors of the camp system that April is well established in unit records and veteran testimony. By the war's end, the record compiled by these units was extraordinary by any standard. More than 18,000 individual decorations were awarded to the roughly 14,000 men who ultimately served in the 100th and 442nd across the course of the war, including 21 Medals of Honor, 52 Distinguished Service Crosses, 559 Silver Stars, more than 4,000 Bronze Stars, and 9,486 Purple Hearts. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team earned 5 separate Presidential Unit citations in a 20-day stretch of fighting in the Rhineland alone, an achievement no other U.S. military unit has matched. The casualty rate sustained by the regiment, well over 300% of its original personnel strength when replacements are accounted for, remains one of the highest of any unit in American military history, a grim statistic directly tied to the aggressive, high-exposure tactics that had made the unit so effective and so feared in the first place. To place that figure in perspective, it means the unit was, in effect, rebuilt with fresh replacement troops several times over across less than 2 years of combat, each new wave of arrivals absorbed into a fighting culture and reputation that had already been set by the men who came before them, and which German units on the opposite side of the line had already learned at cost to take seriously. The historical impact of this record extended beyond the battlefield. General George C. Marshall, then serving as Army Chief of Staff, praised the men of the 100th and 442nd as superb, saying they showed rare courage and tremendous fighting spirit and that everybody wanted them. General Mark W. Clark, commanding the 5th Army in Italy, was recorded stating that these were some of the best fighters in the U.S. Army, and that if more such troops were available, they should be sent to him. These were not casual compliments. They were operational assessments from senior commanders responsible for planning offensives against fortified German positions, and they reflect the same underlying reality that German battlefield reporting had already acknowledged from the opposing side, that assumptions about these soldiers. formed on the basis of ancestry and racial prejudice rather than demonstrated capability, had been badly wrong, and that both Allied commanders and enemy forces had been forced to revise their expectations after direct contact. What makes this convergence historically significant is that it occurred independently, on both sides of the front line, without either side coordinating or being aware of what the other was concluding. American senior commanders assessed the 100th and 442nd through the framework of operational planning, which units could be trusted to take and hold difficult ground. German units assessed the same soldiers through the framework of battlefield survival, which opposing formations required extra caution, reinforcement, or a change in defensive posture when they appeared on a unit's front. That two entirely separate military institutions, operating from different assumptions and different intelligence pictures, arrived at the same broad conclusion about this specific unit's effectiveness is itself a form of historical corroboration, the kind that carries more weight than either assessment would on its own. The long-term legacy of the 100th and 442nd extended well past 1945. Many veterans returned to a country still marked by the same prejudice that had shaped the unit's formation in the first place, and it took decades for full recognition to catch up with the historical record. In July 1946, President Harry Truman personally reviewed the 442nd on the White House lawn, telling the assembled soldiers that they had fought not only the enemy but prejudice, and had won. In 2000, a review of wartime medal records, prompted by evidence that Asian American soldiers had been systematically passed over for the Medal of Honor despite qualifying actions, resulted in 20 additional medals of honor being awarded to Nisei veterans, including Yukio Okutsu, more than half a century after their actions in combat. In 2010, Congress voted to award the Congressional Gold Medal, the nation's highest civilian honor, collectively to the 100th Infantry Battalion, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and the Military Intelligence Service. Formally recognizing what battlefield commanders on both sides of the front line had already concluded in 1944, that these units represented one of the most effective infantry forces fielded by any army in the European theater. Today, the 100th Battalion, 442nd Infantry, continues to exist as the only remaining infantry unit in the United States Army Reserve, headquartered at Fort Shafter in Hawaii, carrying forward the lineage and designation of the wartime unit directly into the modern force structure. Its history is preserved and studied not only as a case study in infantry tactics under fire, but as a case study in how quickly and how completely battlefield performance can overturn institutional prejudice, provided the men involved are given the chance to demonstrate it. The historical record of the unit has also been carried forward through decades of institutional and scholarly work. Extensive oral history projects, including nearly 300 veteran interviews compiled by researcher Masio Dews for her history of the units, and continuing documentation efforts by organizations such as the Go for Broke National Education Center in Los Angeles and the Nisei Veterans Legacy in Hawaii, have preserved first-hand veteran testimony that corroborates and extends the documentary record left in War Department files, Signal Corps photographs, and captured German reporting. The National World War II Museum, the U.S. Army Center of Military History, and the National Archives all maintain dedicated holdings on the 100th and 442nd, reflecting the unit's recognized significance well beyond the Japanese-American community it was originally drawn from. Veterans of the unit were also central figures in the post-war redress movement, which culminated in the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, in which the United States government formally apologized for the wartime incarceration policy and provided reparations to surviving detainees, a political outcome that drew directly on the moral authority these veterans had earned in combat decades earlier. The Congressional Gold Medal awarded in 2010 was formally presented in a ceremony at the U.S. Capitol in November 2011, attended by surviving veterans, many by then in their late 80s and 90s, closing a loop that had begun nearly 70 years earlier with a War Department report questioning whether men like them could be trusted to serve at all. Return then to that ridge above Suvarito in June 1944, and to the German soldiers who watched a position they believed was secure collapse within hours. Their assessment of the men responsible, distilled into a two-word phrase that entered the historical record on both sides of the front line, was not admiration freely given. It was a grudging, battlefield-forced recognition that the racial assumptions underpinning their own war, and in a different form, the assumptions underpinning the American internment policy these soldiers' families were living under at the very same moment had failed the moment they were tested against reality. The original problem this story began with was never really a military one. It was a question of trust, whether a democratic government at war would extend the basic presumption of loyalty to a group of its own citizens on the same terms it extended to everyone else. In 1942, the honest answer the United States gave to that question, through executive order, through disarmament, through incarceration, was no. The men of the 100th Infantry Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team spent the next 3 years answering that question themselves, on ground in Italy and France and Germany, at a cost measured in thousands of Purple Hearts and hundreds of graves. They did not need the German army's respect to prove their loyalty or their capability. But the fact that German testimony, recorded in prisoner interrogations, battlefield nicknames, and captured reports, independently arrived at the same conclusion that Army generals, and eventually the United States Congress would take decades to fully acknowledge, remains one of the most striking pieces of evidence in the historical record for who these soldiers actually were and what they actually did. It is a reminder that reputations earned under fire, unlike policies written in fear, tend to hold up.